Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Generative AI in Healthcare. It's a program we are producing together with our partner VSP. I'm Stephen Collens, the CEO of Matter. Our mission is to accelerate the pace of change of healthcare, and we do a number of things to advance that purpose. We run an incubator for healthcare startups. Since we launched in 2015, we've worked with and supported 1,000 companies from around the world that range from very early to growth stage startups. Our member companies have raised more than $5 billion now to fuel their growth. We also run accelerators, 6 to 8 a year, all in partnership with large health systems and life sciences companies and payers and associations. In the next couple of weeks, we expect to kick off one that's focused on maternal health in partnership with HCSC, Organon, Stryker, U Chicago Medicine, Baycare, Parkview Health, and the Laerdal Million Lives Fund. We also work with large enterprises to help them build their innovation capabilities. We have a suite of education and training and insight services that help them make sense of emerging technologies and figure out how to harness them. And we're a nexus for people who are passionate about healthcare innovation. We bring people together to be inspired and learn and connect with each other. And we work with organizations such as VSP to put together events such as this one today. Today's conversation is about the future of generative AI in healthcare. You don't have to try very hard to see some pretty spectacular claims about the potential of AI to transform everything, including healthcare. Our discussion today will be about what's real right now, what's coming, what are potential pitfalls, and where are the real areas of opportunity that we should all be focused on. We put this program together, as I mentioned, with one of our corporate partners. It's the VSP Global Innovation Center, which is the innovation hub of VSP Vision. VSP is America's largest vision company. Their mission is to empower human potential through sight. They have 85 million members and a network of more than 41,000 doctors. They recently published a report on the future of generative AI in healthcare, and we have 3 leaders with us today to discuss the report and the space generally. So Jay Anderson is the head of emerging technology at the VSP Global Innovation Center. Jay has held strategy and innovation roles across a variety of industries, including automotive and publishing and technology, and brings a really unique perspective to this conversation. Alex Lennox-Miller is the lead analyst for healthcare IT at CB Insights, which is one of the leading companies providing intelligence to businesses about technology. And Alex collaborated with VSP on the generative AI report. And we have Hilary who's a managing director at Insight Partners, which is a venture capital firm with $100 billion under management. They have 800 investments, including 75 in healthcare and life sciences. And Hilary started and leads a group within Insight of 150 operators and growth partners who help Insight's portfolio companies scale. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. If anyone has questions that they want to ask, drop them into the Q&A function. I'll do my best to weave them into the conversation as we go. And with that, let's get started. So kick things off, starting with Jay. What should the audience know about you and your organization and how your work relates to generative AI in healthcare?
Yeah, thanks. Jay Anderson, I'm the head of emerging technology at VSP's Global Innovation Center. Like Stephen said, that I've got a pretty broad background in terms of different industries, most recently in automotive. The GIC, the Global Innovation Center, is what we call the lens into the future for VSP, and we focus on 3 areas primarily: sustainability, health access and equity, and patient experience. And so I feel like emerging technology kind of underpins and enables us to be able to do work in all 3 of those spaces. We've been learning as much as we can about AI for a few years now, but especially generative AI since ChatGPT took off. I think that's going to be a focus for us for the foreseeable future. And thanks for having me today.
Thanks for being here. Alex.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. CB Insights is a market intelligence and strategic intelligence company. We have a tech platform with hundreds of millions, if not more, data points on venture capital firms, startups, patents, partnerships, business relationships. And as analysts, we use that to write about the current state of the startup landscape, how technology is evolving, and how that's going to affect our different areas of focus. Obviously, over the last 18-ish months, generative AI has been one of, if not the biggest topic in healthcare technology. And so it's something that we have looked at a lot, written a lot about, including the report with VSP, and expecting to be covering it for a good long time going forward.
Well, I always enjoy the CB Insights reports, and glad that you're here as part of the conversation. Hilary.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I'm with Insight Partners. We are a global venture capital and private equity firm investing primarily in SaaS-based technology companies, of which healthcare plays a large component, given just the enormous impact that healthcare has on the GDP and the enormous role that it plays in our society. So today we've done about $2 billion of investment into healthcare itself. Into health tech companies. We have about 35 active companies, but we've made about more than 50 investments over time in health tech companies. And several of those companies have got components of AI associated with the products that they provide, and or they're actually born in AI. In other words, they're AI from the get-go. So excited to talk with you today about what those companies are doing and where we're seeing innovation in the industry. And as Stephen mentioned, in addition to my work with these companies, I also lead what we call Insight Onsite. It's the value add organization that Insight has, over 150 people strong, who are experts in scaling software companies and who work alongside our portfolio companies on site, helping to help them scale.
It's such a great model. Thanks for being here. Really looking forward to this conversation. Alex, I want to start with you. In the past few years, the number of terms that people use to describe different aspects of artificial intelligence seems to be growing about as fast as NVIDIA's market capitalization. Help us center the conversation. What is generative AI? We don't need this forum to be a technical conversation, but I do think it's important that we all have a framing of what it is that we're actually talking about. So how is that different from machine learning or natural language processing or neural networks or all the other things that people use and have been using to refer to different aspects of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. The term AI has been thrown around, for so many different purposes and in so many different ways. And now we're seeing generative AI, experience kind of the same spread. Generative AI, just to give it the most basic definition, has to be an AI algorithm that is creating something. That's really the fundamental difference between generative AI and the kinds of analytic AI that we have been seeing for a while now. Those kinds of algorithms, machine learning algorithms, are fundamentally about identifying correlations and relationships between variables within a data set. And that's how we've seen them used. It gets used to identify trends within a huge data set, or find potential indicators of disease, or when a patient is going to be most likely to need attention or most at risk of hospitalization. Generative AI has a component which is doing that, but then it has a second element, which is creating a new data set that is statistically equivalent to the data set it was trained on or analyzed. And that's the fundamental generative part. It has to be creating something, whether that's an image, a movie, a piece of text, an overlay on a screen. If it's not doing that, it may be very sophisticated AI. It may be using some of the same technology. It may be using some of the same software structures, but it's not generative.
I'm so glad I asked that question. I feel smarter now. Hilary, the hype around generative AI has kind of climbed up the Gartner hype curve. I'm sorry, I'm not saying the CB Insights hype curve, but I think Gartner made a name for themselves with this hype curve a long time ago. So it's just vaulted up there faster than a lot of other technologies that I've seen over time that at least take a little bit longer to climb up the hype curve. And the expectations seem to be extremely inflated now about what it is or can be doing. Is that your take? And what are you seeing to sort of bring it back to earth that has real potential in the next 12 to 18 months, or maybe is even today creating real value in healthcare?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So, I want to start with a quote, Arthur C. Clarke, for those of you who are sci-fi fans, and I am, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I do think that we're starting to touch magic. There's a lot of hype for sure. And you see that at the inflated valuations that, is being paid for AI companies across the industry. On the other hand, we're already starting to see glimmers of value that's going to be created. And I think we're just touching the tip of the iceberg, really. So, if I think about where the magic's going to be deployed, I think of it in two ways, certainly in the US healthcare system. One is fix the system. So fix and improve the current system, which is the healthcare system, the administrative landscape. And then the second is enhance the outcomes. So fix the system, enhance the outcomes for patients. And in terms of fix the system, there's just so much low-hanging fruit where AI and GAI can really drive value. Claims adjudication, batch processing, revenue cycle management, clinical note-taking. So one of our portfolio companies, Alma, provides a solution for providers of behavioral health to work with patients. About 75% of the behavioral health therapy calls that patients have are on Zoom. Those calls are recorded or can be recorded now, taking into account all the privacy and the HIPAA policies, etc. But AI is able to create those clinical notes. Obviously, the therapist is the person who is validating them, approving them, editing them, but it is saving patients, it is saving therapists, 15 minutes or so at the end of every call, or at the end of every session. And that adds up significantly in terms of their quality of life, as well as their ability to focus on patients, not focus on paperwork. So those are the kind of things that I think the magic can start to work on and sort of fix the system admin stuff. And then in terms of enhanced outcomes, we're starting to see the early innings of, really just physician augmentation, for want of a better word. So, one of our portfolio companies, we actually have two, ScreenPoint Medical is reading mammograms. The AI is reading mammograms, and Covera Health is reading radiology x-rays. And both of those are augmenting the experience and the capability of the existing radiologist to diagnose appropriately. These are just basic stuff, but it's already massively important, and having huge impact. So, when I think about areas, in the outcome component of improving the lives of patients, we really think about what's AI's ability to support in terms of preventative care. And we can talk further about that as we get along, because I know my panelists have other stuff to say. But preventative, how do you think about diagnostic? So how does AI help diagnose, like with radiology and augmenting radiologists? How do you treat, and what are treatment pathways that can be enhanced through radiology, through AI, and then the final follow-up. And so I really think about it in terms of prevent, diagnose, treat, and follow-up. And AI is going to have an impact in all four areas.
And do you see just to go back to Alex's definition of generative AI and your Arthur C. Clarke quote, which I love, is there a real step change from AI to generative AI that's really enabling a whole suite of new possibilities that maybe weren't weren't as accessible, weren't as viable, weren't as magical as when we were using just normal AI?
In the case of radiology, the answer is yes, because as Alex mentioned, it's a learning system. It's this iterative learning organism, as it were. And so while you can have a database of millions of radiology or X-ray of a mammogram, the ability to predict what a patient outcome could be based on that patient's demographics, comorbidities, age, other mammograms that look like this, other incidents, it's kind of learning the information all the time and just becoming that more useful and accurate as an augmenter and decision support tool for radiologists and physicians.
Thank you. Jay.
Can I just add one more thing to that?
Absolutely, please.
One of the biggest differences, and one of the most impressive things about generative AI is that generative AI is actually capable of creating its own data sets. Whereas historically we've been restricted to whatever we've got records for. And so as we start to see, generative AI, imaging is a great example. There's so many different kinds of cancer, so many different rare kinds of disease that there just isn't a huge amount of data on. And generative AI can actually intake what data we do have from that and create a set of images and data points and diagnoses and even the artificial patient histories that allow itself to train in a much more effective way on diseases that have incredibly rare occurrence or just, don't have the level of attention that maybe they should have had historically.
Yeah, and Alex, actually, just even picking up on that, sorry, Stephen, to interrupt, but I think it's apt to your point, which is, we've invested in a company called Unlearn, which is doing digital twinning in clinical trials. And there's always been this ethical concern in clinical trials if you're the placebo arm and you really deserve the actual therapy, the fact that you're not getting the therapy in the interest of bigger science, whereas now all patients can receive the therapy and the placebo arm will be a digital twin. To your point around creating data sets and having this predictive capability, that will fundamentally change, how we think about clinical trials as well.
Well, Jay, I want to turn to you, but I actually want to dig into that for a second because that's really fascinating. Is there a regulatory pathway at this point that's clear with the FDA or other regulatory bodies around the world to allow for clinical studies that use digital placebo arms? Is that a conversation that's ongoing, I guess maybe is the way to say it.
I think it's a conversation that's ongoing. I think what I know is happening today is the digital twin arms are being run in conjunction with the placebo arm, and they're looking to understand efficacy and accuracy, running them in parallel. I don't think anybody's ready to only hand it over to just the AI component, but the process is underway.
Got
And
it.
the FDA has approved the use of real world data and the analysis of real world data and simulation using it as part of the clinical trial process. So this is an ongoing conversation, but it's one that's moving forward at a pretty good clip.
So interesting. Okay, Jay. So you and Alex collaborated on the report that we mentioned earlier, and in it you sort of organized the world of generative AI into 5 areas where generative AI solutions have the potential to make a large, significant difference. So just sort of abbreviate them: system cohesion, empowering patients, provider burnout, medical devices as a category, and then ethics. What are you most excited about in the near term? So 12 to 18 months within those 5 categories. What do you think is most interesting and has the most potential to both create value and be transformative to health and healthcare?
Yeah, I think that there's 2 of them there that are connected that I'm most excited about. When we talk to doctors, like Hilary, I think, alluded to as well, there is a lot of just computer time and screen time that they have to do in order to, fill out the electronic medical records, and, downstream there's billing and all these other kinds of tasks that we think the generative AI is going to be able to help improve that process over time. I think that having more time to treat patients is what pretty much every doctor would rather have. And so being able to, help with scribing and coding and summarizing notes for patients and things like that, I think that's going to be big. And I do think that that's something within that 12 to 18 month time frame, hospital systems and doctors are working on this, are testing these kinds of solutions already. But I think that that also leads into the empowering of patients, because, I've certainly had the experience where I've gone into, for a doctor's appointment, and, I wish I could remember a couple of the details, and I, perhaps forgot them. So I think that being able to, get a patient handout that's, tailored for me, for like my, based on my experience, who I am, my familiarity with the condition, all of those things build trust in not only the provider that you're working with, but also the patient plan itself. And if you understand it and you have trust in it, then you're going to probably adhere to that patient plan better. So I think that's another thing too, that within this time period that we're going to get better at. And I think it's going to make for healthier people.
Alex, what about you?
Yeah, I mean the ability to take burden off providers is an enormous difference maker to my mind. In a previous part of my life, I spent a lot of time working with hospitals and health systems, and for as much attention as the sort of ambient documentation part of this gets, and it's well deserved, there are so many other parts of the clinical process that are incredibly time consuming and incredibly tedious. When I think about the amount of time that providers spend on pre-visit planning, on reviewing medical records, on doing medication reconciliation, those are all areas that generative AI is actually incredibly well set up to deal with. And so the ability to save, 10 out of 15 minutes of combing through a medical record before an appointment, because you've got a tool that can go through all of that text and give you a really good summary and a timeline and a breakdown of what medications a patient is on, potentially what their reaction and their response to those medications were. That's, really impressive to me, and something that I think will make a lot of people's lives easier. The other thing that really excites me is something that Hilary called out, which is the ability of generative AI to contribute to what's called synthetic imaging, where imaging results can be enhanced, made more detailed, with less time having to be spent actually in the device or in the chamber, or with smaller doses of contrast dyes. And that opens up the ability to image people who are in higher risk categories, who otherwise it wouldn't have been available to lower the cost of imaging, to make it available to more and more people. And that's one of those things that, it may not make headlines at any point, but it's going to make people's lives significantly better, and it's really going to improve the quality of their treatment.
That is, it's consistent with what we've been seeing also, which is a lot of the stuff that is in play or coming isn't like as sexy or as forward facing, but behind the scenes has the potential to really transform a lot of processes and systems. And Hilary, as you articulated, like fix the system, because it doesn't work very well for any of the parties involved. Before we go too far from this, there's a number of questions that relate to the kind of how do you know about how do you validate the data that the system has created? How do you you mentioned synthetic images. There was an article in, I don't know if it was the Journal or the Post or something the other day that showed all of these different kind of images and videos that OpenAI had generated, and they all have weird things in them. When you talk about, the system can create data sets, why should we trust that? And especially, ChatGPT's kind of hallucinations are sort of well talked about and publicly. So both, how do we ensure that the data's right? And then at this point, how are we going to convince people that it's right?
I mean, the simplest answer is that we shouldn't trust it offhand. Um, this is an incredibly important topic. This is something that needs to be, really investigated, really dealt with, and really addressed. Um, these systems are capable of really extraordinary things, but none of them, especially in healthcare, should be trusted without a lot of people paying a lot of attention to it and giving it the attention it deserves. Um, we can look at historical data sets and do a level of statistical analysis that tells us that they are, dramatically lacking in data on minority populations, in women, tell us that, historically, there were groups of people that were under-referred for treatment, and therefore the diagnosis history for them isn't as robust, and therefore an AI algorithm may be less likely to recommend treatment for them now. We can identify that and see that because of statistical analysis. And so we can apply that same statistical analysis and say that a generative AI data set designed to fill in those gaps is doing it in a way that is, mathematically accurate, that is meaningful, in the sense that it's not just filling in data, it's actually making a difference in what recommendations are produced or what diagnoses are produced. But no, I mean, these are really excellent questions. I think we should be skeptical. The potential here is phenomenal, but the stakeholders need to be involved, whether that's the scientists, the pharmaceutical companies, the providers, the patients, and the regulatory authorities. The fact that there aren't currently standards for this stuff, is something that should be addressed. The fact that, we don't have definitions for what is and is not acceptable, is something that needs to be handled. But ultimately, these are resolvable questions. We just have to commit to being willing to answer them.
Jay or Hilary, anything else to add on this particular point? I think it's a really important one, because if people ultimately don't trust the data, the system, all the potential for a lot of these applications to really have the transformative effect that we think that they becomes a bit more limited.
I think a good analogy for this is probably just, the first Teslas that were doing self-driving cars. There was they were going to drive through red robots or traffic lights. I'm from South Africa. They're going to drive through traffic lights. They're going to have accidents. People are going to get killed. Don't take your hands off the steering wheel. And that was 6-7 years ago. That was even before pre-COVID. I think there's just a level of comfort, a level of additional data, many more proof points that we require. And today, sure, we don't allow cars to drive themselves, but self-driving and autonomous vehicles have come a very long way, and certainly in places like China, autonomous vehicles are delivering your Uber Eats without any human intervention. So I think this is just a question of time and sequencing, rather than a question of if. It's just a question of when.
Yeah, I would just add to that too, and underscore the fact that humans need to be in the loop for the foreseeable future. I think that especially when I think users are in situations where they're under a lot of pressure and they get this answer that kind of looks great. I mean, that's kind of the moment where we need to remember that, mistakes can happen, and that we need to make sure that we're training our users to just validate, make sure that everything makes sense, and also provide that feedback. I think I would also maybe add too that even with today's models, there are tens or hundreds of thousands of people kind of on the back end of ChatGPT and other big models like that are taking in input from users and making tweaks and feeding new information back into the model with corrections and things like that. So I think that's important to keep in mind, because it just underscores the idea that these aren't magic boxes that are giving us, interesting and correct answers. They're systems that are developing and being refined. And if you know that, then I think that it suddenly becomes a little bit more obvious to the user that, yes, I do need to validate what this says. It's like the summary is great, but did they leave out some of the important facts that I need to make sure that my patient is aware of? So I think that, again, just this kind of literacy almost around the artificial intelligence and the tools that you're using is going to be key to make sure that we do continue to use them in a way that's responsible.
Yeah, sounds like very much a journey that we're on. Hilary, coming back to you. So this report contains some really big claims about the potential for AI to transform healthcare. It cites a previous study from Accenture saying generative AI has the potential to automate or augment 39% of all working hours in the healthcare industry. I had to read that a few times when I saw it. And I mean, that is a huge number. McKinsey, it cited a McKinsey study that if you apply generative AI to unstructured healthcare data, you could create $1 trillion in value. And that's just essentially doing one thing. So when will we start to see these kinds of large scale opportunities? And I think they probably span between your rubric of fixing and enhancing. Like, if we're talking about trillions of dollars, or at least let's start with $1 trillion of value, and potentially replacing or changing 40% of all of the time that somebody in the healthcare industry spends doing something. Is this like a 3-year journey, a 5-year journey, a 10-year journey, longer than that?
Yeah. I think there's already opportunities that we're seeing, or actual use cases, and some of them are mundane, prior authorization, like, the amount of effort gone, 10 days to get prior auth on certain disease types and certain approvals. A company that we've invested in, Rhyme, is able to, the AI goes out and finds all the various data sources across all the various systems, pulls them in one place, summarizes it all, and gives the person doing prior auth all the information they need to make the decision. So it's very much a decision to support tool, that completely enhanced and augmented by the speed with which the tool can go and get the information needed. So that's super mundane, but if I think about the millions of dollars spent on prior auth, it's probably like, contributing in some measure towards 1 trillion. And there's probably hundreds of little things like that, and so on the one hand, there's just, I don't think there's any one enormous thing that's going to add up to 1 trillion. There's going to be lots and lots and lots of littles. Claims processing, RCM, all of these things are ripe for that. And then on the other hand, there's just decision support that, I think about a company that we've invested in, Ailey Labs. So Ailey is a company that's working with pharmaceutical companies in sort of the office of the chairman, the office of the CFO, helping them make capital allocation decisions around where and how to invest, just pharma dollars on which therapeutic areas, by which drug type, into which country. How do I think about that scenario planning, kind of your FP&A world? But think about that FP&A world applied to specific scenario planning that you need to do in a pharma company, whether that's on clinical trials and how fast they're going to happen, supply chain, and some of the contingencies there. And, I think if you were to speak to, and I know that he's on record doing this, Paul Hudson at Sanofi, is on record saying that, his standardization of Sanofi on Play, it's PL, AI play, which is their internal tool built on Ailey, has fundamentally changed the way these organizations are already doing business. So, you add up, multiple companies engaging in the same behavior, and I think you pretty rapidly actually get to $1 trillion or even more. And then you take something like, a company called Viz AI, which is a stroke detection platform, but it's not just helping predict and detect the real kind of severity of an incident, but it's also pulling in all the workflow and the various disciplines that need to engage around a stroke patient. And if in those kind of situations where a stroke is identified, that kind of large vessel occlusion, 10 minutes makes a difference, 15 minutes makes a difference to outcomes. And so the faster that you can get this kind of workflow and AI working together, the faster you can actually manage the outcomes to a better point that is going to save money long-term regardless. So, I don't know if it's 3 years, 5 years, whatever, but I'm already seeing evidence of companies engaging, in experimentation and usage that's already making a difference.
So on the whether it's 3 years, 5 years, very encouraging that you're already seeing this sorts of experimentation. Healthcare as an industry is not generally the fastest when it comes to adopting new technologies, and for a host of reasons, some of which are very comforting, that you want to validate things before you start tinkering with patients. Some of them that are more just maddening because of the ways that decisions get made and bureaucracies and processes and things like that. You're invested in a bunch of companies that are in AI and now in generative AI, and what are the barriers that you are seeing to the adoption of this kind of new generation of technologies, and are they any different than the barriers that any new generation of technologies has navigated through when working in the healthcare industry?
I think we've mentioned a couple of them already. So the first is this risk aversion, because you're dealing with patient lives and because the consequences are, not can be out of order and in magnitude, and so there is a lot of risk aversion, and the healthcare industry, frankly, has been subject to making wrong decisions and things like that. So people are rightly risk averse and should be. The second is just regulatory oversight, which is what we just talked about. I mean, healthcare is a very regulated industry. We have data privacy rules for a reason. If you just take a look, and for those of you who are following the news, United/Optum's Change Healthcare data outage over the past week has taken down claims management and pharmaceutical processing, and that very much shows the kind of impact that being reliant on any one system can have, and just the impact of malactors in cybersecurity and things like that. So there needs to be regulatory oversight, and there has to be appropriate risk aversion. The third thing that I think is very because it's just very relevant to healthcare, which may not apply to other regulated industries like financial services and that, because there's lots of regulated industries, is just payments and incentives. And so, in this industry in particular, who's going to pay ends up being a big barrier to adoption, or at least a thought process around adoption. And, my own personal theory around this is that payment is actually going to be, or who ultimately is going to fund this, is going to be split across the value chain, depending on where the value resides. And it's not just going to be the responsibility of the payer to pay. Viz AI, the example that I mentioned, they actually got CMS approval for Viz AI as an overlay to be billed as part of stroke detection and management. And that's the first time, to my knowledge, that CMS has actually adopted new technology as part of their NTAP, so new technology add-on payment. So it's an NTAP protocol that sits within the IPPS, Inpatient Prospective Payment Protocol, for CMS. And so I do think that where there's evidence of ROI, the payers are going to change the way that they reimburse. But at the same time, I think providers, patients, pharma companies, the payment's going to be split across the ecosystem, but that's going to be a natural barrier to adoption. And then finally, something that I don't think is uncommon to this industry, but there are a lot of incumbents, and those incumbents hold a lot of market share. And Epic being a big one, and we all like Epic, and Epic's actually a very innovative company, but they own the patient's desk, the physician's desktop. And so if they're starting to adopt AI, sure, the physicians will adopt, but for some of our companies we might invest in, it's incumbent on them to figure out how they get into the doctor's workflow. And it's hard to get into the doctor's workflow to drive adoption if that workflow is owned by an incumbent like an Epic. So these are some of the just natural things that I think will slow progression as to who's going to be the point of contact and the face to those who are adopting.
Yeah. Jay, on this topic of sort of adoption, you've worked across a number of industries, and automotive, energy, publishing, like in addition to healthcare, which makes you sometimes a kind of a rare bird in the universe of people I encounter. Do you see the barriers, and obviously not just talking about generative AI because that's relatively new, but in terms of waves of new types of technology and in other industries you've worked in, are the barriers to adoption more problematic in healthcare? I think Hilary did a really nice job of laying out kind of a framework for what those are. Any comments based on other industries, and if so, anything that you've seen that can help with the uptake that some other industry has done particularly well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. The answer depends on if we're, like you said, we're talking about AI generally or generative AI specifically. I think, if we're talking about AI generally, I think that there's industry specific things that companies might be more excited to jump on, and less, I think AI generally is a little less scary because we've been doing like machine learning and stuff like that for a long time. I mean, getting back to the automotive example, I mean, autonomous cars are full of AI, and they've been, training models and things like that for a long, long time. I would say though that like what I'm noticing that's actually kind of surprising, but actually comforting as well, is how good people are at detecting generative AI content. So there have been some news articles recently, around the use of AI images in like advertising or on TV shows or things like that. And people can spot it a lot of times. Same with text. So you can, sometimes just kind of get a feel for like, hey, you know what, this just doesn't sound exactly quite right to me, or this sounds maybe different than another part of a text. And so I do think that there is like in publishing, for example, or media, that there's different barriers there because, again, it's dependent on trust. If I get a textbook and it feels very AI generated, I'm not going to really, feel like I got a good value for it. I might not trust the information. So I really think that it varies. But if you wanted to like summarize all of it down to something, and it's just, if you've got a business and it depends on trust with the people who are paying you, then you need to do everything you can in order to make sure that that trust is maintained and the quality is maintained, and use these tools responsibly. So yeah, I think that's where I would take it.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, just circling back to that question that we were digging into a little bit earlier about the veracity of the data and how we ensure that, regulate it, and then develop a level of trust that people ultimately are comfortable with, is going to be one of the key steps to more widespread adoption of this particular type of technology. Jay, Hilary was talking about the various kind of barriers to adoption, and one of those is around payments. And VSP is the largest vision insurance company payer in the country. I'm just wondering how you're obviously giving a lot of thought to generative AI, and just how are you thinking about adopting it maybe in your own business? How are you thinking about potentially covering solutions that incorporate generative AI? Sort of where are you on that curve of thinking that through?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that we're exploring. I think that we don't, in managed vision care, we don't necessarily have the same complexity of billing that medical insurance typically has, just in terms of the number of conditions and things that are covered. And so there's a little bit less complexity there. So it's definitely something that we're working on. I know one recent project that we did really looked at the different kinds of pathways that would be required in order to technically implement certain solutions based on what kind of outcomes we wanted to get. So again, just having that that intelligence and understanding within an organization to identify, like, is this something that we can use an off-the-shelf product for? Is this something that we have to build the model for ourselves in order to be able to do the things we want to do? Maybe there's a feature within an existing product and things like that. I think that understanding what those pathways are and how to navigate those in an efficient way are really kind of where we're focused on at the moment.
What about sort of the ethical considerations? There's a lot of different there are some of the same ethical considerations that we've seen forever in healthcare involving patient data but there's some that seem more complicated with generative AI, and wondering how you see that, and also maybe vis-a-vis other industries which you've had so much other experience in.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there's an ethical requirement to make sure that people are getting what they expect from you. So, if you're going to a doctor, you're expecting that doctor to, examine you and identify what's going on and come up with a treatment plan. And you're expecting them to do that using the best tools that they have. I think that sometimes, for decision support, then an AI tool might be great because it could help to validate a particular diagnosis. You might be able to use it to come up with a first draft of a treatment plan and things like that. But there's still this ethical duty to make sure that you're providing the best possible care to that patient. I think that also there's an ethical, when we're looking at AI generally, making sure that we are setting expectations appropriately for systems that are autonomous. I mean, I think the automotive industry is the area where that's been really important. I mean, back in my Ford days, I think that, I can't speak for them, but I know personally, I was expecting to have fully autonomous cars a lot sooner than now. I expected my next car to be able to do that. But I think what we're finding is there's this last mile problem. And so, we're certainly able to use semi-autonomous systems on more than just, 5 major highways in the US or in certain geographies that are geofenced, which is the case for a lot of these current self-driving tests that are going on. So I think that when we, talk about the different kinds of features in a car and what they can do for you, you have an ethical duty to make sure that they really understand the implications, and so that they don't, again, trust too much. And I think that many of the companies are doing that well.
It's great. It's terrific perspective.
I'd add one thing to that, but just think of the world where you do get to a point where you can trust how mind changing that could be. As an example, there's a small company called Kintsugi. It's looking at voice intonation and snippets of voice to identify depressive disorders. And so if I'm a person who calls into I don't know, an Optima or a Cigna or some kind of help center, and if the AI can provide the agent on the other end of the phone with some indicators as the person's mental state, and help that agent triage the patient into the right care just based on voice intonation, sure, we need millions of data points to be able to and we need to have double check that, the voice intonation that's being picked up and the words that have been spoken and what the patient's saying correlates with actual, real world diagnoses. But wow, that could be game changing. So I think that there's a lot of experience going on. There is there's a couple of large payers who have proof of concepts going on with Kintsugi right now around testing and experimenting with that. Who knows how long until everybody feels comfortable that there is sufficient proof point. But when there is, it's going to be game changing for someone who calls a health center and who's not feeling great.
It's a great example. So Hilary, I'll stick with you. And kind of related to what you were just describing. So I was moderating a panel the other day, and one of the panelists was from a very large radiology company, and they developed internally an AI overlay. I don't think it's necessarily generative AI, but for this purpose, it doesn't matter. And they've shown that it helps make an accurate diagnosis 15% more frequently than without it. It's not replacing diagnosis, but it's a diagnostic aid, and it makes the whole process 15% more effective. But it's not reimbursed in the US. So this AI overlay, and they charge for it. So they charge patients directly a small fee. And what they've seen, which is probably not surprising, is that in wealthy areas, and their clinics are located in wealthy areas, patients pay for it. And in more under-resourced communities, they don't. And so when new technologies come up, and in particular, vis-a-vis this conversation in generative AI, are there opportunities for generative AI to reduce healthcare disparities, or is it likely to sort of exacerbate equity issues that plague our system, of which that example I gave is just one very small example of how that plays out in real life?
I do have a point of this, and I know I see Alex nodding his head as well here. I actually think that where we're headed is much greater equity, much greater equality as a result of what AI can produce. I think that it will be game changing. I'll give you just a couple of examples. We have a saying here at Insight that there are more radiologists on one street in Boston, which happens to be Longwood Avenue, if any of you come from Boston, than there are literally in multiple countries in West Africa. And so, the access to care is what AI is radically going to change. And not just the access to care, but the access to the best diagnosis, the access to the best of what the medical industry has to offer. Idoven, for example, is this portfolio company that has a cloud for all EKGs. And it's constantly looking at how do you interpret those EKGs across millions of people, millions of patient populations. For the one EKG center in Nairobi or wherever it is, that physician who doesn't see that many cases, who doesn't, hasn't got a cohort of colleagues all to collaborate with, being able to upload that to the cloud to get information from colleagues globally. This is a workflow coupled with AI, but I think it's all going to be workflow coupled with AI. So those kind of things are enormous. Forta is another example. There is a chronic shortage of qualified autism specialists in this country, like people who have children who need help, are on waiting lists for months and months to get help. Well, AI has, Forta has an app that's built with AI that helps create learning programs that turns a mom or a dad into almost as good as a nurse practitioner. The nurse practitioner still has to be there still has to be oversight, but you can get a long way just with at-home help. And the final thing I'd say about this is I think that something like language translation, communication between a physician, all of that is, and a patient, all of that is going to just drive greater health equity. I'll hand over to Alex because I know that he's got a lot to say here as well.
Yeah, fundamentally, AI is just a tool, and it's going to depend on how we use it. If we decide that we don't really care and that we're okay with everything being, dependent on the ability of people to pay for it and what companies and what healthcare systems, are willing to invest in it, then yeah, it's going to make things worse. It's going to exacerbate the problem. On the other hand, if we're willing to use it for all the things that Hilary mentioned, then it has the potential to make an enormous difference. The other thing I want to mention, because I think Hilary covered a lot of the questions of access and other things really well, is a lot of the issues that we've seen with quality of care and equity of care have to do with not just the ability to access care, but with the kinds of recommendations that an algorithm gives, the kinds of care that people are offered even when they have access to it. And that's another area where generative AI is capable of making some really big differences. We've talked about, the issues with data sets, but for example, when we look at precision medicine and when we look at the effects of different medications on different demographic groups, the effects of different medications on people of different ages, the effects of medications on people with different medication regimes, what we discover is that things like dosage, things like which combinations work best are incredibly variable. And the standard of care tends to be based on very limited data sets of very limited populations. Generative AI has the capacity, and we have companies that are looking at this. We have companies that have products in this space to provide really detailed, specialized breakdowns of not just, the potential factors involved, but what medications are going to work best for an individual person, what their treatment regimens should look like, what the dosages should be. And that is going to be an enormous difference maker in terms of not just access to care, but the effectiveness of care across the breadth of human variation.
We have 2 minutes left, so maybe last question. There's a question in the chat that relates to education and training of medical professionals, and just if you have seen anything that wasn't addressed in the report, but it's an interesting question. Does generative AI play a meaningful role? Are you seeing anything out there? I don't know if Hilary, you're seeing any companies that are using generative AI specifically around education and training?
It's definitely going to play a huge role. I think that what you're really referring to is just the kind of staff augmentation. We know that there's a chronic shortage of nurses in the US. It's a hard job. There's a lot of administrative manual work associated with the role. And most people go into the profession because they're carers, because they want to give, because the mission of being with patients and supporting and helping patients is where they're focused. And so there's all going to be this component of training folks on the new AI, training them on the use of these new tools. As Alex says, at the end of the day, it's just a tool. But if those tools can really free up time to enable people to do their passion, which is really heal and be part of a profession that is a healing system, not just a sick care system, but a real healthcare system, I think that, we should only but embrace AI.
The areas where we're seeing the most solutions pop up right now that are using generative AI are in surgery, where AR and VR simulation of surgery, whether it's for education and training, whether it's for preparation and rehearsal, has some really astonishing possibilities. And generative AI, because of its ability to create in real time, a live simulation with events and, not just a really simple, replicant of the human body, but the kind of, really in-depth, detailed physiological digital twin that we've talked about earlier is pretty impressive. And I would imagine that it's only a matter of time until we see that kind of tech applied to, other medical simulations, anatomical training, things like that.
Such an interesting conversation, such an interesting future that we have with generative AI helping improve health and healthcare. I'm really looking forward to the possibilities and appreciate all 3 of your perspectives. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for including us.
Thank you.